Welcome to A.U.M. Ask Us Marketing. I'm your host, Callie Fedosinko of Callie Collective, a digital marketing agency designed to build relationships between financial advisors and their target audience through data-driven content, websites, and advertising. Our episode today is brought to you by the Financial Planning Association, otherwise known as the FPA. The FPA is a great resource center, providing education, support, and networking opportunities for financial advisors like you. And they've got a great national conference coming up this September where you can meet me in real life. Today, we're talking with Dr. Derek Pollard. And no, he's not a medical doctor. He's a PhD in English, a former professor, and a professional content writer. And we're going to talk to him today about copywriting best practices to do it yourself and when you're hiring a professional. So let's bring Derek in. Welcome, Derek. How are you?
Hey, Callie, it's great to see you again. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this long and storied history of guests that you've had on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you talk about wordsmithing.
Well, and for the sake of full disclosure, because I
Yeah.
know that's such a big deal for all of us
Mhm.
on the call, I'm still teaching. I'm
Oh.
not doing it full time, but it is such a part of my DNA. I
Mm,
really can't envision stepping away. It's
mm,
such an integral component to the learning process,
mhm.
teaching. And so I'm still active teaching part time.
I love that. I mean, that's kind of the point of AUM is to education, right? So
Yeah,
you're going to be the perfect
totally.
guest. So, as I already mentioned, I want to talk to you about how an advisor can write stellar content for themselves, but how they can also work with a professional writer.
Mhm,
So let's start with some quick tips for the DIYers.
mhm.
Um, writing for yourself. You've taught English, you
Yeah.
have and still are teaching for 25 years to college students.
Hmm.
Hmm, bless you. Um, although that's better than high school. What is the best advice you can give to someone who has writer's block? Because I can tell you that's something
Yeah.
that I run into myself.
Well, I think like with all things, there's the short answer.
Hmm.
But I think the short answer can be flippant here. The short answer is it doesn't exist.
Hmm.
Just get out of your own way, get
Okay.
back to work. But I think that disregards the fact that almost all of us at one point or another have the experience you've just mentioned.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we can do is just sort of reconceptualize the
Mm.
experience we're having.
Mm.
Writer's block just sounds like a big, really bad deal.
Yeah.
That's not something that I think any of us want to experience. I
Right.
think one of the things that we can do is just recalibrate
Mm.
and really kind of take stock of what it is we're experiencing. I think in most cases, it's not that we're blocked. It's not that there's a weight or an obstacle we're trying to overcome so much as we're just fatigued.
Mm.
It gets tiring, and I know
Mhm.
all of our listeners have had that experience regardless of whether they're on the content marketing side, whether they're on the advising side. There just comes a point at which you lose your spark and
Yep.
you got to get your groove back.
Mhm.
And so I think one of the steps you can take again is just to kind of rethink the experience that you're having.
Mm.
I think the other part of it is I've had the great good fortune not only to teach college and university students, I've taught high school,
Mm.
but
Oh,
I've also taught. I've been a teaching artist in the schools.
yeah.
I did that when I was living up in Syracuse, New York,
Mm.
and I mention that because I don't think this is going to come as much of a surprise. The best students that I have ever worked with are children
Mm.
because kids more often than not, certainly up to a certain age, don't get in their own way. They do the
Mm.
thing that as adults, we often kind of lose the ability to do or forget how to do,
Mm.
play. And I think that
Mm.
that is one of the best ways in which we can overcome those obstacles that we find,
Mm.
whether we're talking about copywriting, content creation, whether we're just talking again about getting our groove back.
Yeah.
I think it's important to step away
Mm.
And I think it's important to find ways to play. Now, some of the ways that you can do that, again, I would just say go back to your childhood toolkit. What were
Mm.
some of the things that you did that allowed you
Barbies.
to, yeah, exactly. Your doll collection, just sitting down with a pile of Legos,
Mhm.
building, creating stories, sort of getting lost in that imaginative exercise. The poet Jim Morrison encouraged us to conduct self-interviews. I've always found that to be
Mm.
incredibly helpful. Just
Mm.
start asking yourself questions that are relevant or irrelevant.
Yeah.
Um, I think the other thing you can do is just, again, kind of loosen up your feeling that all of the words need to fit together and make sense. Just unloosen that. Don't
Mm.
worry about it. Just sit down and start to play. Put
Mm.
yourself in the position of a prospective client. And I don't
Mm.
just mean a client avatar. I
Mhm.
mean, walk it back to that point
Mm.
where you yourself didn't know how this particular financial vehicle worked.
Yeah.
You weren't familiar with market analysis. You didn't know what to look for when you were considering investment options.
Mm.
Go back that far and start asking yourself some questions so that you can answer them in ways that you yourself could
Mm.
understand. In other words, play dress up for a bit. Do the things that you used to do without
Yeah.
feeling so self-conscious.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that you'll find there is that it's not a block. It's
Mhm.
you're just tired. You,
Mm.
you just need a bit of a break.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess you just gave us some methods, but how should someone get started with copywriting or content writing or any kind of writing?
Well, I think play is integral. It's one of the reasons that is the first step in the poet framework that I've
Mm.
developed. Uh,
Mm.
it precedes organization and execution because until you feel that freedom,
Mhm.
until you've experienced it, I think more often than not, you're going to feel a sense of obligation, and content creation, copywriting will
Mm.
become a chore. And
Mm.
we tend not to really get excited about chores.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, mindset is incredibly important in terms of
Mm.
starting out. And then don't feel like, I, I guess there's a very obvious pun here. Don't feel like you're facing a blank page every time you sit down.
Mm.
You're drawing on a network of experience. You're
Mhm.
drawing on a network of expertise. You're listening and are plugged into conversations. And truthfully, I think this is one of the reasons that advisor marketing has been so exciting for me.
Mm.
There's so much overlap.
Mhm.
And so advisors are having conversations with clients every day.
Mm.
They're either preparing for them, they're hosting them, they're meeting with clients, whether it's virtually or in person. The fact of the matter is, your content marketing is really just a client conversation that's
Mhm.
facing
Mhm.
outward toward prospects. And I think
Yep.
that's another really helpful way to look at it. You're just having a conversation that you would already be having with a client with somebody who doesn't know how good you are to work with
Yeah.
yet,
Yeah.
right?
Now you just mentioned your poet method.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, it's a writing framework. It's
Okay.
not exclusive to copywriting. It's a
Mhm.
content creation framework. But
Mhm.
again, you and I were talking about this
Mhm.
before. Acronyms are a big deal, right? We
Easy
seem
to
to
remember.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think that this is just, based on all of my experience, both in academia and certainly outside of it, as
Mhm.
a professional content marketer, that framework is important. And this gets back to the
Mhm.
question about where do you start? What happens if you find
Mhm.
yourself in the weeds? If you're able to begin with play
Mhm.
before you start to organize, right, you're going to find that sense of expression is a lot
Mhm.
freer, and you're not going to feel that sense of obligation at the start.
Mm.
Once you start to organize, then we're talking about strategy, then we're talking about techniques, and we're talking about the specifics of implementation. That's the next step. Execute, get it done.
Mm.
Right? I mean, that's another one of the greatest ways to move from point A to point B is just to do the thing.
Mhm.
And so getting the plan in place is an integral step. Play precedes all of it. Execution is also very important, right? I
Mm,
think we often look past it because it's so self-evident, but execute. And then, of course, the component that, again, you and I have talked about quite a bit,
mhm,
test,
mm,
right? Make sure that it wasn't just an intuitive feeling you had that this was going to catch fire, but go back and make sure that you're actually looking at the numbers.
mm,
Are the strategies that you've
mhm,
developed yielding the results that you expected? Are they exceeding them? Is a particular piece of content performing unexpectedly well? Make
yeah.
sure that you have the analytics on hand, and make sure that you're reviewing them on a
Mm,
regular basis so that you can really pinpoint what's working for you. And although repetition can be quite a hobgoblin, there is something about finding ways to repeat yourself in
mm,
constructive ways, because that's
mhm,
how we remember. And again, we all know you're looking at 12 interactions at the very least before a prospective client reaches out to connect with you.
mhm.
So finding ways to say the same thing in new ways without creating any fatigue for your audience is also imperative.
Yeah. Not only 12 before they contact you, but uh, one of the books I read, don't ask me which one,
Yeah.
says that it takes 7 times to remember something. Like,
Yeah.
you have to hear it. And I can affirm that that is true from team meetings that I have, where
Yeah.
we would keep it every week up there for an announcement. And,
Yeah.
it would be interesting that when that thing arose in real life, we wouldn't remember.
Well, I think it's again, we're presented with so much information on a daily basis,
Mhm.
and there is only so much room available to us, and we prioritize. And again, I think this is a wonderful takeaway in terms of the long term strategy involved in content marketing.
Mhm.
The truth is, again, even though we're talking about ways to combat fatigue, the truth is more often than not, right about the time or a little past the time where you're like, I can't believe I'm saying this again,
Exactly.
that's the first time your next client tuned in.
Yep.
They have heard it for weeks or months, in some cases years, but
Yeah.
that point at which you're like, "I cannot say this thing ever again in my life," that's the point at which you have just gained a new client. So,
Mhm.
again, it's just one of those steps that patience will reward you over and again. But
Mhm.
it's another reason why sometimes it's really nice to have somebody else either taking part of this off your plate or
Yeah.
all of it off your plate, because it can get really tiresome.
Yep. Yep.
Mm,
What about keeping up a consistent publishing schedule?
yeah.
I mean, as we know, consistency is key to a thriving marketing plan. I mean, a lot of times people are failing just because they didn't stick with it, right?
Yeah.
But oh my gosh, it can feel impossible for a business owner to keep up with. Like, as a professional writer,
Yeah.
how do you encourage people to stay consistent?
To be realistic. Right,
Hmm.
more than anything else. And again, there's a very important distinction to make here between consistency, which, as you have said, is really imperative,
Mhm.
and a slavish adherence to scheduling.
Mm,
Those are two different things. You can be consistent without feeling the drudgery of repetition. I've got
mm,
to do this. I've got to do that. I have to keep moving this forward. If you're reaching that point, that's whether you are aware of it or not, that's seeping into your messaging and that is being broadcast to your
mm.
audience. We are very intuitive creatures and we
Yeah.
pick up on those signals. This is why working with language at the granular level can be such an advantage to
Mm.
advisors,
Mhm.
because if you're working with somebody who understands how all of those little things work, the things that
Mm.
people don't realize they're catching, but they are,
Mhm.
you have a tremendous advantage. And I think that that's another one of those things. Again, one of the through
Mhm.
lines already here is fatigue. How do you combat fatigue? You be realistic with yourself.
Yeah.
You make a schedule, you create a cadence that is manageable to you, that allows you to remain enthusiastic. And
Mm.
there ain't no apology needed for stepping away when you need it, because
Mm.
all of the research shows, my experience certainly has shown over the years, and I see this whether, again, I'm in a classroom, whether I'm working with an advisor as a content marketer, whether I'm working on a book project with a client.
Yeah.
If you don't take time, and
Mm.
that length of time and how we spend it or take it is different for each of us. But
Mm.
creativity does not run 24/7. You've got to
Mm.
prime that pump. And more often than not, it just means unplugging, getting away, taking care of yourself. And so if you're setting a schedule that feels like an enforced march, I think you're setting yourself up to
Mm.
fail, right?
Mm.
Scheduling in advance is a great workaround for this.
Mhm.
I know you know that very, very well. Um, but again, even if you are committed to posting in the moment,
Mhm.
make sure that you have a schedule that is manageable for you, and don't feel like you've wrecked everything if you're like, you know what, today or even this week,
Yeah.
I'm not feeling it. It's
Yeah.
fine, right? That's totally fine.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about advisors who have a large enough marketing budget that they can hire a copywriter.
Yeah.
There's a lot of writers out there.
Mhm.
How can someone make sure that they're hiring someone who fits their needs? And what should they look for
Yeah.
when they're looking for a writer?
Well, I think this is another one of those places where there's so much overlap,
Mm.
because advisors already know the answer to this.
Yeah.
Your expertise is critical. I know the research is
Mhm.
suggesting that is the first thing an advisor's prospective client wants to be
Mm.
assured of. They need to be confident you know what you're doing.
Mm.
And they need you to be able to solve their specific issue. The same is
Mhm.
true for content creators and copywriters.
Mhm.
You need to develop a rapport. You need to be able to develop a working shorthand so
Mhm.
that as deadlines approach or as difficult conversations arise, you feel comfortable having them.
Mm.
If you're working with someone who you can't have what my father always referred to as a come to Jesus meeting with, if
Mhm.
you can't have a difficult conversation, you're not working with the right person. Even if
Mm.
they're delivering content to you, you have to be able to trust them. You have to have that rapport. And that's one of the first things that you need to be attentive to. You need to
Mm.
cultivate that intuition. You
Mhm.
certainly need to be able to look to ensure they have a proven track record. But if you're not jiving with the person
Yeah.
that you are working with or are considering working with, that's telling you something, and it's telling you something very important. It doesn't mean that they're not extremely well qualified. It doesn't mean that they're not the perfect fit for someone else. It
Mhm.
just means they're not the perfect fit for you. And I certainly know we've had these conversations before, and I have found, um, I, if I'm in that position
Mhm.
as a prospective hire for an advisor
Mm.
and I'm
Mhm.
feeling that way, then my very first action is going to be to let them know,
Mm.
and then take out my Rolodex of all of the extraordinary people in this field
Mm.
that are in this orbit that I
That
can
might be a
point them
better
to.
fit. Yeah.
Because ultimately, that's the win that everyone is searching for. And I
Yeah.
am not going to take somebody's money to pretend to be the content creator that I
Mm.
know I'm not.
Mhm.
If I have that feeling, or if an advisor has that feeling, pay
Mhm.
attention to it, examine
Mhm.
it. Don't simply shut the door, but make sure that you feel at home with
Mhm.
working with that person. And if that's the case, they're going to deliver, and you're going to develop a relationship that goes much deeper and further than a transactional relationship.
Mhm. Mhm. Now, a lot of writers aren't professional. A lot of writers, a lot of advisors are
And
not professional writers.
a lot of writers aren't
Yep,
professional writers. You're
fair.
absolutely right about that.
Um, how can they qualify somebody's writing? Is it just, oh, hey, you know what? I liked that. Or is there something specific that they should be looking for in the writing?
Well, I think even more important than whether it chimes for me as a reader, do you know in your gut, and do the numbers back up the fact that this is going to resonate with your ideal client?
Mm.
And again, I think one of the things to look for, and also just listen for, social listening,
Mhm.
it's free. You
Mm.
can do it all day long, right?
Mhm.
Go to a social channel,
Yeah.
follow content creators, follow content marketers, get a sense of how they're doing what they're doing. Look at their websites. If it's resonating with you, that's a really good sign.
Mhm.
you know your clients is
Mhm.
going to resonate with them.
Mm.
And if you feel confident that this content creator is able to adapt,
Mhm.
is able to reach out in those ways, difference between outreach and reaching out. If they're able
Mm.
to reach out in those ways, I
Mhm.
think you're on the right track. And that's somebody you want to keep on file. That's
Yeah.
somebody you want to continue to follow until you're at such a point as you're either ready to hire, you're going to bring somebody else onto your team. So that's a really, really good way to
Yeah.
gauge whether or not they're delivering for you.
How do you grade your college students' writing?
Mm. It's a great, it's a great question,
Yeah.
and it's one of the ways in which I have found it invaluable to be able to draw on that experience. It, there's a common misconception,
Mhm.
and in fact, I was just helping a student overcome this misconception last
Mm.
week
Mhm.
that your professors give you a grade.
Mm.
Again, I'm thinking about this in the context of content marketing. That there's nothing further from the truth than that. There's very little subjectivity, if any, involved, other than me being absolutely thrilled when a student takes a step or an
Yeah.
advisor takes a step, and you can see, oh goodness gracious, they're there. It just
Yeah.
happened. Like they are now communicating directly with their target audience.
Mm.
Um, but I think that the misconception is that there's it's a subjective. I you know I felt that it was this grade.
Mm.
There are rubrics, right? It's all mapped out, and I always encourage content creators. I always encourage students to use the rubrics. And again, I've developed them both for students and for advisors. Use the
Mm.
rubrics as
Mhm.
pre-flight checklists. If you know that you need to accomplish goal X, Y, and Z in terms of this latest email marketing campaign that you're
Mhm.
developing, right? And this gets back to the testing part of the POET framework. If you know what the goals are and you're reverse engineering, then you already know what you need to be doing. It's just a question of figuring out the most compelling way
Mhm.
to do it. And so I think working backward like that is always a great start. It's one of those kind of I always get shocked reactions when
Mhm.
I tell people as a reader, one of the first things I do is read the last paragraph of any book I read.
Mm.
And they're like, "Well, what's the point of reading the book?" And I'm like, "Well, I get to start and I get to see how we get to that
Mm.
final moment. I get to not only experience the work,
Mhm.
but I get to understand its architecture. I get to understand how it's accomplishing what it's doing. And again, that's another thing to be looking for a prospective content creator.
Mm. Mhm.
Are they not just hitting the surface,
Mhm.
but are they creating a sort of immersive experience? Are they approaching writing as design,
Yeah.
or are they just knocking out taglines or email subject lines? Those are two
Right.
very different things.
Mm. We also have a comment from More Than Money Radio. Wait, hold on. Gotta show it here. Speaking about cons or professional writers and picking the one that's for you, they make a good point. They also need to understand the compliance department, which Derek, I'm sure you've had just as much experience as I have.
Well,
It's
so the
compliance.
so the misconception here is compliance is where
Mhm.
all creativity goes to die.
Mm.
And I think that there is a sort of systemic and ingrained adversarial relationship.
Mhm.
As with any good, lasting relationship, it's a partnership.
Mhm.
The sooner into the process you collaborate with compliance, you invite them in,
Mhm.
the greater the reward. I think it's a misconception that there's resistance there. I mean,
Mm.
ultimately, they're there to protect you, right?
I've actually always felt like compliance forces me to be more creative.
And I think that's an
Yeah.
excellent point. And what a again, it's a wonderful way to reconceive of that critical relationship, because if
Yeah.
they're partners, if they're involved in collaborating, it means they're stakeholders and everybody has a
Mm.
greater sense of achievement and shared purpose. And that's a win for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions about working with a copywriter. One, how can you make sure that their writing is in your voice?
Hmm. Well, again, everything that we're talking about has to do with authenticity, right?
Mm,
And I think it's one of the great ironies. How can you write in my voice?
mhm,
Your voice is one of your most unique attributes, right?
mhm,
It has to be on every UVP document you create,
mhm,
cultivating, refining, and celebrating your voice.
mhm.
If anyone tells you they can do that for you, I'd turn tail and run. If they assure you that they will get as close as possible,
Mm,
that's something very different. And that's another thing that you could be looking for, right?
mhm,
Because I think,
mhm.
again, the sort of common wisdom is it's a sort of ventriloquist act, right?
Yeah.
Like you hand me over, we develop a strategy playbook, we develop the ideal client avatars.
Mhm,
I hand this over, you come back with some suggestions, then we have it figured out, and I basically just become you, right, on
mhm,
social media
mhm.
and emails. That's not at all the way this works, and I think that that's one of the reasons collaboration is so important,
Mm,
whether you're in a done for you or done with you context,
mhm,
because you're there are going to be little things that you do
mhm.
that are so characteristic of you being you
Right.
that they have to show up.
Yep.
And although a skilled and expert content creator will be able to pick up on those and start to include them,
Mhm,
it's always going to be something you do a little different. And again, that
mm,
gets back to, can you have those conversations? Are you working with
mhm.
somebody who invites that
Right.
feedback from
Yeah,
you? And if you are, I'd hold on to them, because
yeah.
that is that can be a rare circumstance.
I'd also say there's a difference between a brand having a or someone writing in a brand's voice
Yeah.
versus writing in a person's voice. And I think it there's a crossover with advisors because a lot of time advisors are starting out as a person
Yep.
and then they want to develop into a brand, and that's when there's like that shift
Yeah.
and a lot of tension between um what we're proposing should be written and how they want it written, but you're no longer writing as that person, you're writing as the brand. And so I think, it becomes an important but hairy distinction.
Well, I mean, truthfully, too, you just think about it in terms of, say, a website, or let's say
Mhm.
your LinkedIn profiles plural, right? You still
Yep.
have that autonomy and can still be forward as your own self on your personal profile, and you should be. That's where the
Right.
majority of your traffic will come from.
Right.
That's the content people are seeing. For whatever reason, although I am optimistic that LinkedIn will finally catch up, your
Mm.
company page is just a placeholder.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, people are following it, but your content, your reach for your company page content is minuscule compared to what you're getting from your personal profile.
Mhm.
Great to cross promote on a platform
Mhm.
like LinkedIn. Share your company posts from your personal profile,
Mhm.
but you're seeing an exponential drop in reach. Having
Mhm.
said that, if we think about a website, you
Mhm.
think about a homepage in terms of that brand voice and putting forward that sort of brand personality.
Mhm.
And there are these opportunities in, say, the welcome copy on the homepage,
Mhm.
or our mission, or the about page, where you can infuse and draw on that personality and that
Yep.
relatability that is the cornerstone of your firm. So
Right.
I love the
Mhm.
forgive the imprecise. I love the synergy that exists, and
Mm.
I love those challenges of being able to
Mhm.
extrapolate out from a brand that really was singular
Yeah.
into a firm, right?
Yeah.
That's such a cool step, right?
It is. I
Yeah,
mean, it's an exciting step.
yeah,
You've grown your business to the point that
yeah,
your business.
yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah,
Oh.
it totally. Yeah, that's to be celebrated. And that's
Yeah.
the other thing. I mentioned this to you earlier.
Mhm.
I've always taken Nikki Clark to
Yeah.
heart when she says finance should be fun.
Mm.
The same is true of your content market. It should be
Mhm.
fun at heart. You
Mhm.
should be having fun. And
Yeah.
yes, there are many days, trust me, where you're like, this is not fun. Not fun. But it should be. And I think
Yeah.
that that should be one of your goals, is to,
Mm.
because that, again, it comes through in the work that you do.
Mhm. when you're working with a client, or an advisor is working the copywriter, what is the best way for them to deliver revisions? Now, you've already made the point, which I think is a very good one. You need to be comfortable enough with the person to even bring up revisions.
Yep.
But after you do, is there like on the phone call or, typing, or what's the best way to deliver a revision? And even if you can have those conversations,
Yeah.
being mindful of not being critical.
Well, I think there's a difference between criticism and constructive criticism.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, have had bad experiences with
Mhm.
people. I mean, for all intents and purposes, just to lay everything on the table. This is one of the reasons that writing is so challenging, content creation. This is why so many people haven't, or advisors haven't yet adopted video, because
Mhm.
we're afraid.
Yeah.
We're afraid of falling down in front of everyone. We're afraid of being embarrassed. We're afraid of doing something quote unquote stupid, although
Mhm.
quote unquote stupid is where every great idea starts, right? Um, I think that that's the thing. We're afraid
Yeah.
of doing something that we're going to be ridiculed for, or people are going to point and laugh, or
Mhm.
the minute that you give yourself permission to fail forward, the minute you realize that that is a step towards success, is the
Mm.
minute so much of this falls away and you get to be you. And that's the thing
Mm.
that every single prospect that will become a client is looking for, is
Yeah.
somebody who is unafraid to be themselves. In terms
Authenticity.
exactly. In
Yep.
terms of revision, I mean,
Mhm.
again, you have an incredible network of systems in place for
Mm.
your clients.
Mhm.
Um, we have built similar systems out in terms of content delivery, in terms of revisions. But again, I don't think this is going to be unfamiliar to advisors.
Mhm.
I don't want that to become an impediment. I don't want a
Mhm.
prospective client or a client to feel like, oh, I've got to upskill on these 5 platforms in order to be able to get you these notes for revision.
Mhm.
I'm always in favor of adapting the systems that we have in place to meet advisors where they're most comfortable. If that's Slack, then that's how we get work done, right?
Mm.
We'll adapt the
Mhm.
system so that we can deliver. If it's Google Docs, which
Yeah.
is, I mean, honestly, this is another one of those fallacies that I think
Mhm.
really gets in our way. We think of writing as a singular endeavor.
Mm.
The truth is, exceptional writing requires an exceptional team. The sooner you have
Mm.
that team in place, the sooner you're going to start seeing the benefits that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Working in Google Docs, it is so
Mhm.
cool, right? When you're unafraid to be like, oh, that's not what I meant to say at all.
Right.
You've got a willing partner who is
Mhm.
not going to be judgmental in their feedback or that working shorthand I referred to, and you get to work in real time together. That's one of the
Mhm.
coolest things ever. Like when you
Mhm.
are no longer afraid to just type something you know is not really what you mean to say because it's kind of the idea you want to explore.
Right.
And you've got somebody 2 paragraphs down looking at something else that, they're tidying up and you can move
Mhm.
back. Oh my goodness gracious. That is such a wonderful feeling. There's so many sparks that fly in a case like that. So whether it's Plutio, whether it's Google Drive, wherever the advisor is most comfortable, that's where I'm going to meet them. And I would certainly hope that their
Mm.
their partner, if it isn't Constellar Creative, is willing
Mm.
to and able to adapt the systems they have
Mhm.
in place as well.
Yeah.
If they've streamlined them so it does not require 10 different tutorials and 6 different platforms that you've got a network, then that's, again, that's very, very helpful. But ease of use is so important. So,
Mm. What if you're continually disappointed with the writer that you're working with? I mean, what are the steps you should take before firing them?
well, again, here's the short and flippant answer.
Mhm.
You're not obligated, right?
Yeah.
If they are not delivering, then bolt.
Mhm.
If they're
Mhm.
not the right partner for you, you are, as long as the contract is fulfilled or you
Yeah.
have met the exit requirements, you notify them in writing, whatever the contract stipulates.
Sure.
Having said that, again, the short answer is almost always the flippant answer. And
Mhm.
I think a much more empathetic, constructive, and ultimately helpful way to do it
Mhm.
is to do exactly what the writer David Sedaris's mother encourages him to do in his
Mm.
fabulous essay, Us and Them.
Mm.
Really look at yourself.
Mm.
Are you communicating effectively?
Mhm.
Have you articulated your goals? Do you know where you want to get to? Have you been listening to your content marketing partner
Mm.
who perhaps in the very early stages of working together may have
Yeah.
said to you, for instance, hey, increasing your organic reach on LinkedIn, we're looking at probably 120 days before
Yeah.
you start to
Mm.
see any appreciable movement.
Mhm.
If you're 60 days in
Mhm.
and you're feeling like it's time to move on, I'm going to suggest that it always takes two to tango.
Yeah.
And that's really important. And if you find in doing the hard work of self reflecting that maybe I wasn't clear, maybe I didn't know what I needed to get done, maybe my timeline has changed,
Mhm.
maybe I found myself in a situation where I needed to switch gears in order to do this with my business. I think if you're communicating effectively, consistently, and you still find that your content
Mhm.
marketing partner is not delivering for you, then it is time to have that conversation. But make sure it is a constructive conversation. And if the person is invested in your success, give them every opportunity to then course correct so that they can meet, refine the strategy, and exceed the expectations that you've both set.
Mm.
Right? I think it is so easy. I think we're hardwired for this as human beings to look outside of ourselves.
Mm.
It's really easy to point a finger and say, those results you told me would show up in 120 days. Why aren't they here yet?
Yeah.
I know it's only been 10 minutes since that last email, but those results, where are they again?
Right.
I think it's really important, again, to be accountable to yourself and also reflect. And again, if you're finding that after that process and after having conversations, your
Mhm.
content marketing partner is not listening or just isn't delivering in the ways you need them to, then it is a very important and expeditious step to take
Mm.
to be able
Mhm.
to move to somebody. And again, if your marketing partner is truly invested in your success
Yeah.
and hasn't just hooked you and reeled you in, then it certainly has been my experience in situations like that. I just work, I work overtime in order to be able to connect them with someone I feel is going to be able to meet the expectations and goals that they've set.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm. We did, I don't know if you saw it, but we did have a comment that said extremely valuable advice from you, Derek.
Well, I very much appreciate that. Thank you. And
Yeah.
it's always a pleasure. And I know this sounds cliche, but an honor to sit down and be able to talk about something. I mean, again, I think this is true for advisors too. We get so passionate about this. We
Mm.
work at it. We're so immersed in it that I
Mhm.
think quite often it can be hard to walk it back. I always love every opportunity to sit down with advisors and fellow content marketers and talk shop,
Yeah.
and figure out ways to be able to help one another succeed. Every time somebody wins, particularly in industry that is so important and
Mm.
misunderstood, every time an advisor wins and it facilitates their client's success, we're all
Mhm.
better off for it. So
Mhm.
I'm always
Mhm.
thrilled for opportunities like this.
Well, it was such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge.
Yeah, you got it, Callie. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. Let's see here. We've been talking about content and writing. And if you are just looking for someone to do it for you, we do offer a service called Content Done For You. Pretty straightforward there. They always say clear is better than clever. So if you're interested, go ahead and scan that QR code. And then, of course, join us next Monday as we talk to, uh, you know what? I didn't put his name in here. Andrew, as we talk to Andrew from Testimonial IQ, and we're going to be discussing how you can grow with testimonials. This will be somewhat similar to the growing with Google, but this is going to be looking a little bit more at the regulations that compliance has and software you can use to work with compliance and overall testimonials. So join us next Monday. As always, it will be at noon Central. And until then, have